What would you do if a Chinese submarine suddenly surfaced just 3 miles from America's most powerful aircraft carrier? Not in some war game, not in a simulation, but in real life, inside the deadly protective bubble of the USS Ronald Reagan. One wrong move here could mean disaster, a collision, an armed standoff, or even the spark for a shooting war between two nuclear powers. But instead of panic, the US Navy stayed calm. They watched, they listened, and in those tense minutes, something incredible happened. Because the submarine that thought it was showing strength was actually handing the Americans an intelligence jackpot. This isn't just a story about ships at sea. It's a story about silence, patience, and the thin line between intimidation and embarrassment. It started with almost nothing. On the USS Shoup, an R. Lee Burke-class destroyer escorting the carrier Ronald Reagan, a young sonar operator leaned forward in his chair. On his screen, the ocean looked normal. Background static, faint echoes, the usual symphony of underwater noise. Whales, waves, distant merchant ships. But then, just for a moment, something out of place. A faint, low-frequency pulse, so deep, so subtle, it almost disappeared into the ocean's background hum. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but trained ears, they knew better. The operator froze, marking the trace. One blip, then another, bearing steady, depth about 120 meters, speed, just under 8 knots. It wasn't a whale, it wasn't commercial traffic. It was the classic signature of a diesel-electric submarine, trying very, very hard to stay quiet. He called it out. And in seconds, the destroyer's Combat Information Center came alive. Screens lit up, voices sharpened. Data flowed in not just from the Shoup, but from other ships in the strike group. That single faint whisper was no longer just a line on one man's screen. Within minutes, it had turned into a three-dimensional picture. The Reagan strike group had a shadow, and it wasn't supposed to be there. To the outside world, it was just a sonar contact. But to the men and women on those ships, it meant something else entirely. An uninvited guest had pierced the invisible wall of America's most heavily defended warship. And if a hostile submarine could sneak this close without being noticed, what else could it do? The game had just begun. To understand just how dangerous that submarine's mistake was, you have to picture what surrounded the Ronald Reagan. A U.S. carrier strike group isn't just a floating airbase. It's a fortress at sea. On the surface, cruisers and destroyers formed a shield wall, their Aegis systems scanning the skies and waters with ruthless precision. High above, E-2D Hawkeye aircraft circled like watchful hawks, painting a radar picture that stretched hundreds of miles in every direction. And beneath those skies, the true hunters prowled, the MH-60R Seahawk helicopters. Each one carried dipping sonar that could reach into the depths where submarines tried to hide, as well as electronic sniffers tuned to catch the faintest signals of a periscope breaking the surface. To the untrained eye, the carrier might have looked exposed, just one massive ship cruising the ocean. But to anyone who understood naval warfare, it was clear. The Reagan wasn't alone. Every approach, every shadow, every pulse in the water was tracked, recorded, and analyzed by dozens of sensors working in perfect coordination. That's why the Chinese submarine had stumbled into the worst possible trap. It hadn't just surfaced near a carrier, it had surfaced inside a moving web of surveillance, so advanced that even a single radar sweep or engine vibration was captured instantly. The carrier group didn't need to fire a shot. Just by existing, its invisible shield was already stripping the submarine of its secrets. On paper, diesel-electric submarines are some of the quietest predators in the ocean. When they run purely on battery power, they produce almost no noise, no roaring turbines, no constant reactor hum, just silence. In shallow waters near coastlines, that silence makes them incredibly dangerous because they can sneak up on warships before anyone even knows they're there. That's why navies around the world still invest in diesel boats even in the age of nuclear submarines. For a brief window of time, they're like ghosts in the water. But here's the catch. That ghost act doesn't last forever. Batteries drain quickly, oxygen runs out, and the crew can't hold their breath indefinitely. At some point, the sub must surface, or at least expose a snorkel to draw in fresh air and recharge its systems. That moment, the moment it has to breathe, is when the illusion of invisibility shatters. No matter how advanced the technology, physics is unforgiving. A sub that can hide for hours will eventually reveal itself if it tries to shadow a carrier for days. And the longer it pushes, the more desperate the captain's choice becomes. Surface in a risky place, or risk losing propulsion altogether. That's exactly why the Chinese submarine east of Luzon ended up breaking cover in the worst possible location. Its strength, stealth, was also its fatal weakness. At 7:04 local time, the ocean broke open. One moment, the horizon was clear. The next, a dark sail erupted through the waves, a Chinese Yuan-class submarine clawing its way to the surface. Water cascaded down its tower as stunned lookouts aboard the Ronald Reagan called out the sighting. This wasn't a stealthy maneuver, it was desperation. The boat's batteries had run too low, forcing the captain into the worst decision imaginable, surfacing inside the heart of an American carrier strike group. On the Reagan's bridge, there was no panic, no alarms blaring, no weapons firing. Instead, a calm voice transmitted across an open foray. Equancy, unidentified submarine, you are operating in the vicinity of a United States carrier strike group. Acknowledge and maintain safe separation. Escorts tightened formation instantly. The destroyer USS Shoup shifted to block the sub's path, while the USS Mustin mirrored on the opposite flank. Overhead, a Seahawk helicopter hovered like a hawk ready to strike, its sensors locked on every movement of the exposed vessel. What looked dramatic from the outside was, for the Americans, routine. Their doctrine was clear: don't escalate unless directly threatened. The Chinese sub might have hoped this encounter would rattle the carrier's crew. Instead, it played into their hands. Every turn of its propellers, every radar pulse, every transmission leaking from its antenna was being logged, recorded, and analyzed. For the U.S. Navy, this wasn't a confrontation, it was an opportunity. The calm response wasn't weakness, it was discipline, and that discipline was already turning the submarine's mistake into an intelligence goldmine. Every second that submarine lingered on the surface, it wasn't projecting strength, it was bleeding secrets. To the untrained eye, it was just a dark silhouette rocking on the waves. But to the Reagan strike group, it was an open book. Radars locked onto its profile, recording every measurement of its sail, mast, and tower. Those details, once captured, would let analysts identify the boat instantly if it ever appeared again. Above, the Seahawk helicopter lowered another sonobuoy, no longer searching, but listening with surgical focus. Every churn of the submarine's propellers, every vibration from its diesel engines now running at recharge speed, every hum of cooling pumps, all of it was harvested. These acoustic signatures would be filed away in U.S. Navy libraries, creating a fingerprint so unique that even years later, the same class of submarine could be recognized within seconds. The jackpot didn't stop there. Electronic warfare suites aboard the escorts captured bursts of communication as the sub reported back to command. A satellite ping here, a shortwave message there, each signal dissected for quirks in modulation, tiny imperfections that gave away the transmitter's unique identity. To the Chinese crew, it was just routine communication. To the Americans, it was a once-in-a-decade intelligence windfall. What the sub's captain likely reported as a bold display of presence was, in truth, the exact opposite. His attempt at intimidation had given the U.S. Navy priceless data without a single shot being fired. In modern warfare, silence can be deadly, but sometimes, patience is even deadlier. For the next 10 minutes, the scene was almost unbearable in its silence. The Chinese submarine sat exposed on the surface, engines humming, its crew surely feeling the weight of dozens of American sensors locked on them. To the sailors aboard the Reagan, it wasn't fear of attack that gripped them, it was the razor-thin margin for error. One sudden rudder turn, a misunderstood radio call, even a harmless radar ping could be mistaken as hostile. And when you're surrounded by Aegis destroyers with vertical launch cells primed for instant response, mistakes don't get second chances. Yet the Americans held their line. The USS Shoup stayed fixed off the submarine's bow like a silent guardian, while the USS Mustin mirrored to starboard. Overhead, the Seahawk helicopter circled lazily, but in reality, its weapons were ready to drop within seconds if the sub attempted a crash dive. The carrier itself kept steady speed, launching jets as if nothing unusual was happening, projecting confidence that spoke louder than threats ever could. This was discipline in action. No raised voices, no sudden moves, just calm precision. The U.S. Navy understood that the real victory was not in firing first, but in controlling the encounter. The submarine may have surfaced trying to prove a point, but the only message being sent was Satso. Lear. In the shadow of a carrier strike group, restraint is not weakness, restraint is power. When the submarine finally slipped beneath the waves, the encounter was technically over. No shots fired, no casualties, no dramatic chase across the sea. But the lessons it left behind were anything but small. For Beijing, the message was uncomfortable. Intimidation tactics that look bold on paper often collapse in practice. Every attempt to shadow a U.S. carrier only feeds American analysts with more fingerprints, more recordings, more insight into how Chinese subs actually behave. What might be celebrated back home as a daring maneuver is, in reality, a massive intelligence leak at sea. For Washington, the takeaway is simpler but far more powerful. The U.S. Navy doesn't need to flex its muscles with every encounter. By holding fire, staying calm, and letting the opponent expose themselves, it turns discipline into a weapon. Knowledge, painstakingly gathered in moments like these, becomes the sharpest blade in modern naval warfare, and that's why the Reagan's crew never celebrated. They didn't have to. The victory wasn't about humiliation, it was about patience, restraint, and a deeper understanding of the adversary. The broader lesson is clear. In today's oceans, silence and composure can be deadlier than torpedoes. Diesel boats may stalk carriers in hopes of scoring psychological points, but every time they surface, they risk giving away more than they gain. The future of these encounters won't be decided by who shouts the loudest, but by who learns the fastest. And right now, the balance of learning still belongs to the U.S. Navy. In the end, what unfolded east of Luzon wasn't a clash of weapons. It was a clash of discipline versus desperation. A Chinese submarine, designed to stalk in silence, surfaced in the very place it least wanted to be, the heart of an American carrier strike group. And in those tense minutes, the balance of power wasn't decided by torpedoes or missiles. It was decided by patience, by restraint, and by the quiet confidence of crews who knew they were in control. For the United States, it became an intelligence harvest that will pay dividends for years to come. Every acoustic trace, every radar pulse, every fragment of communication now sits inside classified databases, waiting for the next encounter. For China, the lesson was far more sobering. Stealth has limits, and when those limits are reached in the wrong place, secrecy drowns faster than steel. And that leaves us with a bigger question. In modern naval warfare, is it really the loudest display of strength that wins, or the quietest act of patience? If you were in the submarine captain's shoes, staring at fading battery gauges, would you risk surfacing near a carrier or dive deeper and hope no one hears you? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear your take. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the ocean's most dangerous cat-and-mouse games, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves real maritime stories. And remember,